which means that what we have in mind is that modern science is great. So whatever contributed to it is great. Therefore, the grant of Islam, that's the cause of it. That's absurd. That's total absurdity. Civilization, the things like that dies. It's not worth to live. It's not going to survive because it means it has committed suicide intellectually. It no longer can stand on its own feet intellectually. And so I do not have that in mind. But it is a very profound cosmology, if I sets of cosmology, in the Quran, which over at least 1,300 years of the 1,430 years of the life of Islam since we began counting with the migration of alayhi salatu wasalam to Medina, over this very, very long period, served as the basis for the development of various sciences, which are remarkable from the point of any civilization. For 800 years, Islam produced more mathematics and astronomy and physics and medicine and pharmacology and so forth than any other civilization in the world, including the Chinese, which was also very active, and including the Western, up to the period of the Renaissance. That's a very long time. The West has also only been dominant for 400 years. We shall see what happens in the next 400 years. So I'm not trying to belittle that. But all of these different Islamic schools of science, sometimes not the same, debating with each other. There was tremendous intellectual freedom in classical Islamic civilization. People opposed each other on many, many, many issues, from the question of causality, structure of matter, and so forth and so on. You had debates between people like Al-Biruni and Ibn Sina, two of the greatest figures of the history of science, against each other. But all of these were in one way or another related to the cosmologies that issued from the Quran. It is not accidental that not a single Muslim scientist became an atheist. It isn't that they were more stupid than Richard Dawkins, or people like him, and they think they're very smart, and anyone who's smart is an atheist, called the Brights by them, and anyone who, like myself, believes in God is stupid. No one can read Ibn Sina's Kitab al-Shafa and think he's more stupid than Richard Dawkins, obviously. But these men function within a cosmology at the center of which was always God. And the Quran permitted the development of all of these different kinds of sciences and cosmologies, extremely wealthy scientific tradition, without alienating human beings from the world of creation, which is what, of course, modern science and technology have done. They've alienated ourselves by allowing us, first of all, to build an artificial ambience in which it's easy to forget God. Although it was impossible. In the biggest cities, you would walk 2-3 blocks, you'll be in the countryside. Atheism is born from the city. No nomad has ever been an atheist. It's our export to the rest of the globe. And to allow the creation of an atmosphere in which one can function without thinking about God. When one is in the world of nature, it's very, very difficult to be an atheist. Very, very difficult. So the Quran is the primary source, provided it is not misconstrued by those who think they're rendering a great service to Islam by not really knowing what modern science is, by not really knowing its consequences, by not really knowing that Islam cannot accept any science in which the hand of the supreme cause, that is God, is cut off from that science. No matter how many times you say our prayers, go to noon prayers, and that's irrelevant to the nature of the science, and then, of course, the technology that flows from it, which is its application, and now is causing such a devastation for us. Then, of course, with the Quran comes the Hadith, and the Sunnah of the Prophet, the won'ts of the Prophet. We know very well that the Prophet loved animals, especially cats. Since I'm a very great cat lover myself, I will only repeat to you a wonderful, wonderful letter I received from the great British poet, Catherine Raine, the greatest woman poet of the English language of the 20th century, died a few years ago. We were friends, and she also loved cats. I'd given a lecture in London at Thames Academy on the subject of nature, and she wrote me and said, "Oh, Dr. Nasr, your lecture was so wonderful. Yes, you're right. Nature has fallen, but of course don't forget the cat, which has never fallen. It's in the perfect state that God created it. And we know how much the Prophet loved cats, how respectful he was of other animals, how he treated animals gently. It's on the basis of his sunnah that Islam was the first civilization to develop hospitals for animals. We do not have in ancient Greece, as far as we know. Of course, there were individuals who loved animals, there's no doubt about that, but the whole hospital you had in Aleppo, you had in Cairo, you had in Persian cities, for animals, and all of the promulgation in the Sharia of how to deal with animals as a burden, how to not overdo it, how to be kind to them. Unfortunately, many Muslims do not listen. But the part of the hadith deals with direct instructions of how to deal kindly, not only with your wife and daughters and brother, but also with animals. And the Prophet, as I said, was always very much aware of this. Secondly, the Prophet loved nature. Let's not forget, it was not in a room, but in a cave that the first revelation came to him. In the cave of Al-Hara, on top of Jabal al-Nur, 3 kilometers from the Kaaba, which is in the middle of Mecca, where the first revelation, Iqra, came there. And the Prophet loved to retire to the desert, loved to be under the stars and feel the wind, the breeze, which is like the divine name when you are in the middle of a desert, breezing through you. And he himself in his own life was always a great lover and admirer of nature. And there are many hadiths that people should collect in the same way they've collected hadiths on, let's say, adab, of how to eat, how to greet, all of the other things that we try to follow on the basis of his instructions. Also, how to deal with the rest of the world of nature. Of course, the Prophet did not write how to deal with an octopus. That was not part of the natural scene of the Mecca and Medina of that time, but the principles are there of the care for nature. Then we come to what is the richest source and most accessible source of these teachings. And this I add very briefly. The Quran is too sublime for an ordinary Muslim, no matter how good is the Arabic, to read it and get all of the meanings without the tradition that followed through. This new movement in Egypt called the Coronite movement, just arrested some of them the day before yesterday and threw them into prison. Unfortunately, I don't know why they're doing this, but what they're doing is false. It's as if since I know English, I begin to write on anthropology, because all the books on anthropology are in English. I say, I can understand this book perfectly well, not to talk about quantum mechanics, that I happen to know a little bit about, but something I don't know anything at all about. Just knowing Arabic is not sufficient. So over the centuries, on the basis of the hadith, which was the first commentary upon the Quran, the first commentary upon the Quran is the hadith. Let us not forget that. But then all the other commentaries that gradually build up on the basis of the oral tradition and all the different wisdom literature, they grew this vast body of literature which cuts across different theological and Shariite schools of Islam. That is Sunni and Shiite, Mu'tazilite and Asharite, Sufi and Hanbalite, even Ibn Taymiyyah. May God help him. All of these schools, except for modern Wahhabism, which has a total disregard for this aspect of the teachings of Islam, it concentrates on La ilaha illallah as truth, but is not interested in presence. That's why Mecca is being now turned into Manhattan very soon. Total lack of respect for Islamic architecture, because it seems to be irrelevant to Islam. I'm not talking about that. These are not mainstream schools of Islamic thought. If there are any Wahhabis in the room, you forgive me. But that's how I see it. It's too late in life to be just polite. But the main schools of Islamic thought, from Ibn Sina to Ghazali, who was his opponent, from Ibn Arabi to Fakhruddin Razi, who wrote against him. And if you know the intellectual traditions of Islam, there's very, very diverse schools of thought that existed throughout the Islamic world. There is contained within them an incredibly rich philosophy of nature, or theology of nature, if I may call it. And they're all based ultimately on the Quran. They're all based ultimately on La ilaha illallah. And therefore of great value. Some were written by outstanding scientists. I just mentioned Fakhruddin Razi. He was the greatest Sunni theologian of the Ghazali, but also was a very famous doctor, remarkable scientist. And many others who were not scientists, but there were people who were thinkers, who were philosophers. And many of them were great poets. Some of the greatest sources of the Islamic understanding of nature comes from poetry. Besides the quality of poetry, the power of poetry to take us out of our ordinary consciousness and present us with a truth that's in another world, but at the same time here. There are many didactic forms of poetry. I just recited one from the Masnavi for you. I could recite many, many other poems that I want to give you a headache. But this is also a very rich source of learning and devising a contemporary Islamic philosophy and theology of nature. And then we come to the Sharia. I said that the Sharia cannot be the only source for this philosophy of nature about which I speak, but is extremely important at certain levels. Unfortunately now, a number of Islamic countries are beginning to pay attention to this. Examples. The Prophet himself drew a harim around Mecca and Medina, which was not only a religious harim that non-Muslims could come into, it was also a kind of national park. That is, the creatures were protected. You were not supposed to hunt and kill and burn and so forth and so on. It was really the first idea of a national park that we have comes from him, and the teaching of the Sharia, for example, that it's forbidden to burn trees even during a war. You must not destroy orchards. What was done in Palestine is against Islamic law, putting everything else aside. It's just like killing women and children. It goes along the same line. You must not destroy life. You must keep water pure. How strange it is we have some of the dirtiest water in the world in Islamic cities. That's not as a result of teachings of Islam, as a result of not following the teaching of the Sharia and the very rapid migration of people from the countryside who no longer feel home when they come into a big city. You'll never find a child in a village in Iran or Egypt, countries which I know very well, who would walk in his own village and take a branch of a tree and just cut it off and throw it to the ground. Whereas as soon as the mayor of, let's say, Tehran or Cairo plants a tree, 2 minutes later, some young kid comes and tries to pull the branch off. That's because he doesn't have the sense of belonging. That's another question, a sociological question. But it's against Islamic law to pollute running water. It's against Islamic law to own water as a source for a whole society. You cannot have a private water. You can have a private well in the middle of the desert, which Arabs used to have before the rise of Islam, and they continue to do so later. But in the cities where a large number of people benefit from water, you cannot have a private, let's say, water company. That's against Islamic law. It's against Islamic law to create a cistern for people to come and take water, as many Islamic countries have, and then decide in the third month to throw some arsenic in it. So this is my cistern. I want to do with it whatever I want. These are things are against Islamic law. The question of the protection of space and the privacy of space, which led to the rise of the traditional Islamic urban design. You have a little part of this city. I just came from there taking a walk, the Souq, which incorporates some of the principles of Islamic urban design, which is related to the Sharia in many, many different ways, both that and to Islamic art. And look at the amount of pollution of air inside the Souq and in the big streets outside. You don't need to do anything. Next time, just Take 2 deep breaths and you'll find out what I'm talking about. The Sharia had a lot to say, but it was not the determining factor. The Sharia was there to set limits on our actions, to do what is good, to do what is evil, to do the commandments of God. But the attitude towards the world of nature, except for the prohibitions, the manhiyat, belong to the wisdom literature from which, in fact, of course, came over the centuries the source and inspiration for a philosophy of nature. Now, the 2 very great difficulties that the Islamic world faces at the present moment, even if people become aware of this, which is a very big if. The reason it's so difficult is that most Muslims, deep down, modernized Muslims, have a trust deep down in their heart that the West will take care of it. Somehow Western technology will solve everything. This is not only true of the Islamic world, but the rest of Asia. That is, the most adamant supporters of modernism in the world today are modernized Orientals. Understood? If you're in a place like, let's say, a major American university, where many people are skeptical that, in fact, modern technology can solve these problems. The governments are not, because they come to power on the basis of that. But people who really know what is going on, many of them realize that simply changing technologies is not going to solve the problem. You might give us a little bit more time. The solution lies in a different way of living, in the way of thinking about who we are and how we live our life on earth. But in the Islamic world, you have the double difficulty of thinking that deep down, Western technology knows what it's doing. We just made a few mistakes here and there, polluting its cities, and we learned from them. And of course, our cities are much more polluted now than Western cities because it's really the junk from Western technology that we use for the most part. Cairo is much more polluted than London. Tehran is much more polluted than Washington, obviously. But we think that somehow this problem is going to be solved by them. It's not going to be solved by them. We have to solve it for ourselves. And this cannot happen so easily because the Islamic world is under tremendous economic pressure to receive from the West the crumbs from its bread table. That is, to buy whatever happens to come on the market with very little resistance. That no, I don't want this, this is not good. We have to wait for the West to solve the environmental crisis and say, now I'm importing a car which doesn't cause global heating, warming of the atmosphere, and so forth and so on. This is the very, very great problem. And therefore, the Islamic world, along with other parts of the world, are at the tail end. We still haven't seen anything. Wait till all of China wants to have refrigerators, and all of them want to drive, and all of India, which will have 2.5 billion people who want to live like people in Los Angeles. There'll be no earth left, no globe left to do anything. We have to do something ourselves. And the difficulty is twofold. First of all, we have to be able to reformulate and recast in a contemporary language the philosophy of nature by which we have lived for so many centuries. Not as archaeology, not as simply history, but as present-day reality. And this takes tremendous intellectual effort. It takes knowledge, know-how of both Islamic intellectual tradition and what's going on in the West, and the creative gift to be able to express that in a language which people will hear and will understand, knowing that this is an uphill battle. No government in the Islamic world wants to listen to it on the macro level, maybe a little thing here, a little thing there, but nobody really wants to change the educational curriculum so the children at school begin to see a big difference in how they look at things. It's interesting that in this field, the place where the environmental crisis began in earnest, and worst of all, I don't mean the Ruhr Valley and England where the Industrial Revolution began, but I mean the United States, the most powerful technological society in the world. It is here precisely because you see the effect most acutely, that in elementary schools, already most children are completely different from their parents. Their attitude towards animals, towards trees, towards water is totally different. Many of them, of course, the economic pressures that will come, peer pressure, will make them into Wall Street junkies sooner or later. But many of them will not. There's a change that's one of the greatest hope for humanity is precisely this. And this is the result of a small number of American educators who decided to teach children at a young age to have another attitude than was held 40, 50 years ago at school. And you grow up with that, of course. So it's not impossible, but this is one thing that needs to be done. Secondly, much more difficult. All right, now we have established this philosophy of nature, theology of nature, a worldview. How to apply it? How to apply it? We cannot be sort of blind idealists. It's not going to happen that we're suddenly going to have a government which is going to, from the above, do all of these things. As I said, in my own country, Iran, a major revolution took place in the name of Islam, and everybody thought that the Islamic view of the universe was going to dominate over everything. But it didn't. It dominated over certain things, whereas because of the need for power, I mean both electric power and military power, Iran is now much more technological than before. 30-some years ago, I was the president of Iran's most important scientific university, Imperial University in Iran, the Ari-Emir University, which is the best university in the Middle East in science and technology. I know exactly what was going on. I tried to create a Department of Humanities to veer some of these engineers away from just looking at models from the West. I had a letter just a month ago from one of the old professors, who's the dean there now. He said, after 35 years, your dream has come true. We've started a PhD program at the center, most important center of science and technology in Iran, on the philosophy of science to be taught from the Islamic point of view. Not simply the Western philosophy of science, but how long it will take for that to percolate down will certainly be beyond my lifetime. So even when you have a revolution of that dimension, it doesn't mean that suddenly sane environmental policies are going to be followed. All the beautiful gardens in northern Tehran are gone because human greed oftentimes wins out over wisdom. And this is not only true on Wall Street, it also happens in other places. I don't know what's going on here in this city, but all over the world you see this phenomenon. I will not talk about other Islamic countries on this issue, but I will talk about my own country. So it's very, very difficult to apply. How we apply it is where we can. I think there are major opportunities right now, for example, to change urban design, which is environmentally extremely important in the use of energy, in the pollution of the air. Already as I stand here, there are several centers that are being built in, of all places, Washington, which are based on human beings, not the car. It's the Americans who invented the machine, the car, which tears into the guts of every city and cuts in. The cities are made for cars, not for us, but just a peripheral. It's important to have a road and a parking lot next to it, and then everything comes third, everything else. There are already changes that you see, and the Islamic world certainly has no excuse whatsoever. With this vast architectural tradition, with the urban design, the fact that we had a city of 1 million people, Neyshabur, in the Middle Ages, the first city in history that we know had 1 million people in it. A very, very big urban center, which functioned and in which you had a lot more human connections, a lot less use of where the machine was not around, but they got by. The use of urban design and architecture is something that we have no excuse in not doing. I'm very saddened, I don't want to make commentaries on places because it's everywhere. When you see these monstrosities, 80 floors high, coming up in a peninsula in the Persian Gulf, how much energy is that going to need to run? all those windows that never open during the winter and the summer, and therefore get the natural heat and cold from the outside. Just sit down and calculate what this means for the earth, and that this has been duplicated 100 times in every city all over the world, from Sao Paulo to Cape Town and everything in between. It's not unique to the Islamic world. But we cannot wait for the whole world to solve the problems for us or for themselves. We have to do it ourselves. I feel the field of urban design and architecture is a field in which a great deal can be done. Secondly, there are many technologies, including agriculture, where the application of modern technologies are devastating and which bring much less yield. They destroy things much more quickly. They destroy the topsoil. They destroy the variety of plants. And a lot of study has been made of that. Why commit suicide? Why commit suicide? Let us do what we had learned over the centuries. After all, agriculture is to a large extent an experimental science. You learn through experience. It's very interesting that when we brought American experts, they were supposed to be experts in everything, to Iran in the 1960s. I'd just come back from Cambridge, and one of them was my friend. And we brought to improve the irrigation systems around Iranian cities. And they went to all these cities and they said, we cannot improve upon anything. The irrigation of cities like Isfahan and Yazd are masterpieces of design, and just do what you're doing. They're honest enough because they're getting paid a large amount of money to change, but they were honest enough to say that. There are a lot of fields like that. The handicrafts, to make things with hand. They're not all Muslim societies have a small population like Qatar. We have societies which have tens and hundreds of millions of people. And you could bring back many of the handicrafts which have much less impact upon the environment from the point of view of pollution and many other things, and can be done. And finally, most important of all of these things, to not simply accept every form of technology that comes along. That is, to be judicious and try to create some of our own technological forms. Once one of the best of the Iranian architects, who happens to be working in the Persian Gulf now, after I taught him for years and years to do Islamic architecture, he did a building full of aluminum. So what is he doing? Why did you do this? He saw because of this, because of that. I answered them. It was not economic. It was not anything. It was simply ego. He finally had to say, because the material is there. There are a lot of things out there, but the blind use of them is because of a weakness on our part. There are those, of course, who want to make money. Greed is part of human nature. I'm not saying that greed is going to go away immediately. But there's really an awareness that is do or die, that we are faced with mass extinction and death and worst kind of catastrophes we have never thought about in our wildest imagination, then perhaps something can be done. Let me conclude by saying that for the Islamic world, no protection of the environment can come about without the revival of the Islamic view of the environment. Simply to say that some Swede said so and so is not going to make people follow suit. We need to make use of our own traditions. And the fact that we have not done so, you see the results all over the Islamic world. I don't have to add any more. And I'm hoping and praying at the end of my little talk for you that this little corner of the earth, which is the upper part of the Persian Gulf, where God has created one of the most remarkable, ecologically diverse underground milieus, we can all get together instead of burning Kuwait and throwing oil into the Persian Gulf, as happened some years back, to try to get together and preserve this site, no matter what, as a model how we can live and let live. And in the long run, there's no life for us possible unless we learn to live and let live. Thank you.